Welcome to the mysterious world of Angel of Death, where every shadow hides a secret and every soul has a story. Vanessa Hunt's journey has just begun, and your journey has just begun. Join us as we explore the unknown depths and unravel the mystery. This is EP4 of Angel of Death. Thank you very much for your likes and subscriptions. You can express your opinions in the comments section. Chapter 12, Hellhole Part 2. There was something mildly amusing about my propensity for getting myself in trouble. Not that I made a habit of doing that in my past life. Perhaps when I was younger and no longer had my father's guidance. But even back then, I had proven myself to be a quick learner. I had the gift. Dad had said that many times. I possessed the instinct. I usually knew how to act in a business situation, and that this was the one thing that was critical for running a company. Many times, especially in a delicate business situation, one had to make a judgment call without having all the variables in place. For instance, I knew almost right away that going into the old Absinthe house was a mistake. My instincts told me I was probably walking into a trap. Part of me wanted to alert death to it, but I weighed that against the possibility that I might lose the scent and decided this was far more important. My eyes grew accustomed to the darkness. I saw the red glowing eyes, heard the heavy, raspy breathing. I knew what it was that I faced. This wasn't exactly a demon from hell like Azazel was, but it might very well have been. Back when I faced off against the demon, I had death's wisdom at my side. It was unfortunate that I no longer had that to fall back on. This situation was more like the ones I faced when I lost Dad. It was just me against the world. My mind raced. I knew it was only a matter of time before the first attack would come. I knew the creatures weren't very intelligent still. That mattered little in this situation. Backed into a corner, any dangerous animal would react the same way. It would react out of instinct and attack. I wasn't sure how long it had been since the Class D vampires had fed. I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. An enterprising Class D had decided to take the risk of finding out what I was capable of. Okay, then time to send a message. Activate, I said, releasing the power behind my scythe. My scythe grew to full size in an instant. The Class D barely even had an opportunity to realize what hit it. Next thing I knew, I had properly decapitated the poor thing. Its head rolled on the floor. A fair warning to the remaining vampires. Okay, 50 more to go by my count. There were angry screeches all around me. Guess that establishes me as a threat. Now doesn't it? I said aloud. Now, who wants to be next? I knew I was treading into dangerous territory, but I needed a show of force to demonstrate to these vampires that I was also a threat. Predator, not prey. My scythe began to glow, and I seized the opportunity. My scythe hadn't reaped a soul since that very first encounter, and I wasn't about to let such an easy opportunity get past me. I saw the Class D soul begin to release in the dim light. I swung my scythe to retrieve it. I felt a powerful rush as I absorbed the power of the soul. Death was right. This got easier as time went by. I was hoping against hope that the Class DS were as stupid as I believed them to be. If they were incapable of working together as a team, I stood a much higher chance of getting myself out of this mess. The Class DS kept their distance, unsure of the threat that now faced them. I had become acutely aware of an odd stench in my surroundings. It was a foul, putrid odor. I forced myself to concentrate on my situation.
Analyse, Vanessa, analyse.
My dad had taught me critical thinking from an early age. Determine the outcome you want, Vanessa. First and foremost is the outcome. If the decision you make doesn't line up with the outcome, you don't make that decision. I searched my mind for answers, and promptly arrived at an interesting solution. The nether void, of course. The solution was practically staring me in the face all this time. Death had showed me how he did it. But it was one thing to observe something being done, and an entirely different thing to be actually doing it. Use logic, Vanessa, think things through. I had surmised that despite my obvious shortcomings, Death had probably blessed me with the very same abilities, which meant that I just needed to learn how to trigger them. But I lacked something very important. I lacked experience. The words of Donovan Hunter rang through my mind again. It is not intelligence, Vanessa, that makes fortunes, nor is it experience. I could hear my father's words as if they were yesterday. No, it is guts. It is the ability to go and say, I do not know everything, and there may be far more people who know more things than I do. But goddamit, I will be the one that succeeds beyond them. I forced myself to focus on the details. I could smell things that was an advantage. I could sense the creature's movements. That was an even larger advantage. Far more importantly, I was intelligent. I could outthink them. 2 more Class Ds ventured past their zone of comfort. I could tell that their thinking was primitive, mostly guided by instinct. They came right at me, and I felt the speed at which they moved. I sensed one had jumped in the air at my 11 o'clock, and another rushed at me from 7 o'clock. I avoided the one at my 11 and moved to attack the one at my 7. I disposed of the first one with no effort. Another decapitated head. I quickly turned, whirled around and ducked. It was a risky move, but I felt I could anticipate where the second Class D would land. I swung hard from my down position, so hard that I could hear the blade whistle as it moved through the air. I had guessed right, and the scythe cut right into the vampire. I had severed its torso. This time we're down to 48. Now if I could just trigger that nether void, everything would be perfect. I found myself getting impatient with each passing moment. The silence in the hole was more than a little disconcerting. Every little sound, each and every audible noise and ambient sound served as a warning. With what little light I had at my disposal, I surveyed my surroundings. At least dead vampires don't come back to life. That was a useful observation. The one nagging thought that remained persistent throughout was the thought that I wasn't good enough, that the 3 souls I had harvested so far were not even remotely close to the requirements needed to trigger the nether void. Still, I took solace in Death's own words, "You could have done it on your own." Vanessa think, Vanessa think. Another vampire attacked. It moved too quickly this time and almost caught me off guard. I moved instinctively, bringing my scythe snath in front of me defensively. That turned out to be a smart move, as I felt the vampire's mouth clamp onto the cool metal bar. That would have been my neck had I not moved quickly enough. I pushed the vampire aside by driving the scythe upward, pointing the blade toward it, and pushed downward hard, all the way into the vampire's shoulder. I felt the scythe cut deep into its flesh. I jumped to give myself leverage, adding my own weight as I forced the scythe diagonally down, tearing into the Class DS body soul number 4. Check, the stench was becoming unbearable. I needed to get this done as quickly as I possibly could. The noises continued, albeit more distant than before. The vampires erred on the side of caution this time and kept their distance. I kept trying to calculate the size of the room. It wasn't large, I realized. Probably an area no greater than 200 feet. Still, it was home to around 50 Class D vampires, and I had more than my fair share of the slimy things. I was rather impressed by the fact that the pale things didn't glow in the dark. I felt fortunate I couldn't see my surroundings. The bloodbath I was causing was most certainly of the messy kind. More vampires ventured forth. I wasn't even sure how many this time. I had learned how to fight multiple enemies when I was practicing the martial arts. The key was to bring them all into a single line by going around the enemy in a circle to force them into my rhythm and my zone instead of the other way around. But fortunately, I also had my speed. I ran up the side of a wall, taking note of a few Class DS that decided to follow me, crawling along the side of the wall as their eyes glowed red in the darkness. I jumped off the wall and into a somersault before landing on the ground, leaving the ones on the wall alone for now, and quickly dashed into another group of eyes. 5 sets of eyes this time. I moved swiftly left in a circular pattern, hoping my opponents would follow the plan worked. They were now all in a single line and I could fight them each one-on-one. I swung hard and clipped the first one right between the eyes, as the top of its head got sliced neatly off. My scythe was now glowing from having absorbed so many souls. I could see quite well in the room now. I lodged my scythe into the heart of the second one as it screeched in agony, caught on my scythe. The hapless vampire proved to be useful as a shield against its brethren. The other vampires bit into the poor impaled vampire as it shrieked in agony. There was no friendship among the Class DS. They would tear into their own to get to their prey. I pushed the poor vampire off the scythe and swung again, clipping another one that had taken to the air and landed in front of me. The blade of my scythe went through the creature's jaw and all the way out its scalp. I pulled out, leaving a massive gash in the creature's head as the blood gushed out. I moved swiftly in the darkness, unafraid now, Despite their numbers, the Class DS were no match for me. My scythe cut through the vampire line like a terrible phantom in the darkness. Hot, sticky blood flowed between my fingers as my blade sliced through bone and raw sinew indiscriminately. The blade was the purest form of justice, blind to everything else but its victims, and every bit as capable of exacting tribute when it was due. The ground was becoming slippery from all the blood and gore. Flesh just kept hacking at the flesh, oddly enough. The heat of the conflict seemed to be beneficial to me. With each passing moment, I found myself becoming more and more at ease, almost relaxed. Was this the key to it all? Death was always nonchalant when facing the most insurmountable of obstacles. A persistent thought bubbled up from the back of my mind, and something within me paid attention. Spread out your thoughts. Let your consciousness be felt. I breathed in deep and closed my eyes, exposing myself to the danger that lay before me. I let my body go limp, relaxing my muscles, but part of my consciousness remained awake, observant. I felt an exhilarating rush that I had never felt before. I had released my consciousness into the universe and found, oddly enough, that it was responding in that instant. I knew I did it right. I felt the nether void within me, insistent, powerful. I knew it was void because I felt the same stillness back when death released it. I opened my eyes and looked around. They were all frozen. Class DS filled the room, but they were threatening no more. I noticed quite a few stacked on top of each other, transfixed in time even as they flew through the air. The ones that were on the ground were also unmoving. They probably saw me close my eyes and thought that the time was right to mount an all-out attack. Big mistake. I acted swiftly but purposefully, swinging my scythe in wide arcs, the blade whistling in the darkness, ending on a satisfying note as it dug into flesh and exited. I tried to decapitate as many of the vampires with each strike as I could. I did not know how long I would be able to maintain the nether void. When all was said and done, I reached the final body. I swung the scythe forward, cleaving the vampire vertically, almost perfectly bisecting it. The two equal parts of its body continued to remain suspended in the air, almost like a gruesome piece of art. I had butchered the vampires, and the grisly result of my handiwork all hung in the air. Even the droplets of blood were frozen, the reddish droplets creating an almost beautiful pattern as they filled the room. I breathed out a sigh of relief. I relaxed as the nether void wore off and the vampires' mutilated body parts all fell to the ground at once, culminating in a massive crimson splash as the blood sprayed all around the room. In the darkness, I saw the shimmering haze that indicated that souls were available for reaping. I reaped them all at the same time and felt the familiar but vicious rush of power. Far too much, it seemed. I felt nauseous. I might have overdone it. The trapdoor from above opened with a sudden movement, and I saw Stefan looking down at me. He smiled at me, his eyes glowing in the dark now too. He jumped into the trapdoor and landed in front of me. I found myself facing off against the giant of a man that Stefan was. In the darkness, he was even more imposing. Very impressive, Death Angel, said Stefan, as he opened his mouth wide, baring sharp fangs at me. But let's see how you do against a Class B vampire. Chapter 13, The Brood. It took a long time before either of us made a move. The pit had transformed itself by now from something dangerous to something entirely revolting. It took great effort for me not to vomit all over the place. The stench of dead vampire filled the pit, and it clung to everything. I was covered in vile and putrid vampire flesh from head to toe. Even my hair was caked in vampire blood. Each step I took was a slippery one. It was impressive how Stefan maintained his poise throughout. At least I could see. This time around there was more than enough light now for me to see my surroundings. The trapdoor had been left open, and the darkness that consumed me before was no longer a stifling presence. Still, Stefan was unnerving. I looked at his graying hair and distinguished features. A rather prominent hawk-eyed nose stood out amidst intense-looking gray eyes. It was hard to tell what the man was thinking. I might have been imagining it, but I felt like I detected just the slightest hint of a smile from the man. Tell me at least what I came here for, I said. Stefan chuckled at that and shook his head. Oh, I aim to fulfill my end of the bargain, Death Angel. He raised a finger at me, but not a second before I get what I want. I stared at him coolly for a few moments before speaking. Yes, that's right, rattle him, Vanessa. Don't get sucked into his rhythm. What is it that you want? I asked in a neutral tone, hoping that he wouldn't notice the trepidation in my voice. The slime dripped from my clothing as the stench continued to grow to unbearable proportions. My scythe glowed brightly at this point, having gorged itself on vampire souls. The nausea had returned too. It exacerbated the situation. Being sick was one thing, but being sick amidst a sea of smelly and disgusting decapitated vampire refuse was another thing entirely. Fight me, Stefan said simply. Why should I fight you? I demanded. I grew tired of the games. You have no choice. I can give you what you seek. Death Angel, but not until I am satisfied. Fine. I said, do your worst. There it was again. Just the faintest hint of a smile on Stefan's lips. He looked down on me the way a grown man looked upon a child. His towering frame and imposing presence. I had barely blinked when I realized Stefan had moved behind me. I hadn't even noticed the movement. He had his hand on my neck. He was fast, brutally fast. I could have snapped your neck right now. Death Angel, he said, had I wanted to. It appears you are not taking me seriously. I searched my mind for a way out of this. I had to do it, I realized. I had to invoke the nether void a second time. Stefan moved far too quickly for me to even deal with him. I would need to slow him down. Stefan ran his hands through my hair. It's such a shame that we left you in such a state. Death Angel, your consort. He stopped to pause for effect. Your consort would certainly not have appreciated your current condition. He was referring to Daniel, of course. Damn it. Daniel was in danger now that the vampires knew about his association to me. Activate, I said, as I brandished my scythe in front of Stefan. But the tall vampire was nowhere to be found. Well, it is good to see you mean business, Death Angel. All talk and no action to back things up make for a very boring encounter. Stefan's voice filled the room. He was clinging to one of the walls now. His speed was terrifying. I moved fast, that I knew. But even during my training with death, nothing had prepared me for this. The speed was frightening. This was the power of a Class B vampire. I hated to see what a Class A would look like. I did notice, in fact, that Stefan dressed impeccably. I guess that was something I always noticed. From the fine fabric of his suit to the beautiful pattern tie that he wore. It was almost a shame, because I could see how the vampire refuse from the scene was also having an effect on his appearance. Blood clung to his pristine clothes, seeping into the fine fabric. Such a shame. Were this anything other than the current situation, I might have deluded myself into thinking that Stefan was a model from one of the top fashion houses. Someone who put on Ermenegildo Zegna suits on a daily basis and walked the catwalk. The man had grace and poise despite his age. A silver fox, but a deadly one. Don't space out now. Vanessa, the threat is real. Stefan moved toward me again without warning, but I anticipated it this time. He moved in, once again behind me, and I whirled around in response. I saw his right hand reach out to me, sharp claws protruding from each of his fingers, but the claws failed to connect. I brought the blunt end of my scythe toward him, hitting him squarely in the stomach. I pushed out quickly, trying to keep my distance between myself and him. I knew Stefan's speed could close the gap at any moment. I took my right hand and gripped my scythe, moving it blade up so I could respond further to any potential attacks. I immediately reversed the scythe, righting its position so that the blade arced forward unnaturally. I was hoping to catch Stefan off guard. No one really swung a scythe with the curved portion inward, but I was hoping that the unconventional move would catch Stefan off guard. The tall vampire saw it coming and parried the blade, brushing it away from him, his massive clawed hands guiding the blade aside and away from him. The blade whistled in the air from the force of my swing, but it failed to connect. Damn it, this wasn't going to be easy. I scanned the area for opportunities. If I was going to unleash a second nether void, I needed a diversion, but it wasn't going to be easy to distract an experienced vampire that moved faster than the wind. I was in Stefan's realm right now. I was forced into his zone. I needed to find a way to force him into mine. Asking him to chase me around the room was out of the question. That might have worked for unintelligent Class DS, but Stefan would find me out almost immediately. I needed to make Stefan back off, force him to defend himself. That wasn't easy when he already knew how to fight against Death Angels. I decided to take a gamble. I breathed in deep and hurled my scythe with all my strength, letting it go as I let it fly toward him. I was hoping against hope here. I knew Stefan would know the implications. The weight of the blade had changed. That much I was certain of. The souls absorbed within had granted it more power than it had before. I did not have a good handle on how much power it had. But I was banking on Stefan's experience. My bet paid off. I learned that during the battle with Azazel, when she had dodged Death's blade rather than parrying it. The power of a Death Angel's scythe determines how an entity reacts to it. I could hear my blade continue to whistle in the air as it struck an empty wall. But I was one step ahead this time. The scythe itself wasn't the objective. I was hoping Stefan would move out of the way, that he would dodge the scythe and give a good read on what his capabilities were. He moves to the left far more often than he does on the right. I had guessed correctly in this case. Stefan was a southpaw. That meant that he could be blind to my attacks if I placed them right. I quickly moved to his left, anticipating that he would properly defend that. He did, in fact, react much quicker than I was anticipating, considering the scythe was nothing but a decoy. He blocked my advance, but I anticipated that. I quickly latched onto his left arm, applying as much force as I could on it to immobilize it. I then took my right hand and opened my palms, asking the scythe that I let loose to come back to my hand. The scythe came flying into the air on a return path to my hand. I let it fly for a few moments and didn't catch it. It flew past my hand and right into Stefan's right shoulder, decapitating his right arm. Stefan looked down on his right arm and smiled. Blood spurted from the open wound, but I stared in horror as a new arm grew out of the empty socket that once held it. Almost immediately, that was well played, Death Angel. He said the new arm he grew was drenched in blood. Stefan proceeded to clench and unclench his fist, as if to give him feeling in the newly grown arm. Just moments before I launched myself into a new attack, I heard a series of claps in the room above me. The claps echoed all around me, the dark room. Stefan was now unmoving. He stared at me, but did nothing. Well done, Vanessa Hunter, well done. A voice spoke from above. A second, shadowy figure was looking down at us. Perhaps it is best if we all went back above. And why should I bend to your demands? I asked. Whoever this new entity was, he had the gall to be telling me what to do. Perhaps it is best that you do, Death Angel. There was something about the way that the words were said, something that made me pause. It was the voice of authority, of someone who was used to getting their way. Who am I speaking to? I managed to say. Come back above and you shall find out, the voice said, along with the very thing you came here for. I was fine with that. I stopped moving. A truce had been declared, and I would now have the opportunity to find out what the note really meant in the first place. Before I could even blink, Stefan had moved on up to rejoin the other vampire, and I was left alone standing in vampire refuse. I didn't need any more encouragement than that. I jumped up through the trapdoor. I was painfully aware of how I would appear to the beautifully dressed crowd that greeted me as I emerged from the hell hole. What, you've never seen a Death Angel before? I challenged the crowd, who actually didn't appear to be fazed over my appearance in the slightest. Just as I suspected, everyone in the room was a vampire. I scanned the crowd almost haughtily. I saw, for the first time, fear in their eyes. When I first came in, I was an unknown entity, but I had passed the test. I had demonstrated the abilities that I had, and I had proven myself. I now saw respect, concern in their eyes. I could feel their fear. The air in the lounge felt cool. After having been trapped in the pit for so long, it was refreshing. I have to apologize for the way we have welcomed you, Death Angel. The same voice spoke with authority. I had thought Stefan to be the ringleader, but it appears I was mistaken. I turned toward the direction of the voice, expecting to find the real leader, a man far more experienced than Stefan was. I was more than a little surprised to find myself staring at a man with a rather youthful appearance. He was almost even just a boy. He could not have been more than 16 to my eyes. He wore a luxurious silk shirt, unbuttoned and casual as his well-muscled physique showed through it. Let me introduce myself, he said, bowing to me. My name is Gregor Vincent, and these, he said, indicating the group of vampires that surrounded him, are my companions. Welcome to the brood, I sighed. Another void wasn't going to get me out of this one. Chapter 14 Hot Bath. I didn't speak for a long time. I looked around me at the well-dressed vampires. They looked at me with mixed emotions in some eyes. I saw revulsion eyes that couldn't bear to look upon my person, all covered in vile and putrid Class D flesh. In others' eyes I saw pity for my situation. They understood probably more than most what I had been through, what it was like to face persecution. By far what I saw in many eyes was fear. Fear of the power of the death angel that held sway over them. Was I a threat? Or could I perhaps be a benefactor that could be exploited for their benefit? It was in those eyes that I began to understand the role that I had to play in all this. My mind raced to find a reason. Gregor Vincent was an enigma. His youthful appearance was disarming. He had a beguiling, almost far too youthful smile. Radiant and deep azure eyes stared back at me. A slender nose, deep red lips and a slim jawline made him wildly attractive, almost like a really hunky 16-year-old who modeled on the side. But it was the eyes that betrayed him. I realized it the moment I looked into them. Gregor's eyes saw many things. The liquid nature of those eyes betrayed the years behind them. In those eyes I saw sorrow, anger and hatred, a life that had seen far too much, perhaps over the course of many lives. I saw experience and far more deadly than that. I saw wisdom and guile, things that could only belong to a man with years of experience. This was no 16-year-old. This was a vampire who had lived far too long and who had seen many things throughout the ages. Gregor smiled at me wordlessly for a few moments. "It appears you understand, Miss Hunter," he said shortly after. "Understand what it is you face. You understand who I am, what I represent, despite the fact that no words have been uttered between you and I." Gregor swished the crystal glass he held in his hand and sniffed it, before taking a sip of a red liquid. "I was unsure of you at first, but it appears the Reaper has chosen his newest death angel very well." I cringed. I wasn't entirely sure if he was sipping a 1985 Bordeaux, or something I entirely wasn't comfortable with. Gregor noticed my fascination with the glass. "Relax," he said with yet another smile. "This is entirely Bordeaux, French-made. Only the finest." "What year would you guess?" 85. I said. "You have fine taste. You run a bar." I have no reason to believe it would be anything other than that. Gregor put his glass down and clapped his hands slowly and purposefully. "Well done, Miss Hunter. Your guess is remarkably close. It is an 89 Bordeaux Chateau Haut-Brion. Only the finest. But I would not have expected anything less of you." He moved toward me, his gaze piercing. I did not move. I met his eyes directly. "You think this is a game, don't you, Miss Hunter? Please call me Vanessa. I'm all covered in grime. There's no need for such formality." Gregor shook his head. "Of course. Where are my manners?" He snapped his fingers, and an entourage of beautiful women showed up. "Please see to it that Miss Hunter is properly taken care of." The group of 5 women smiled and bowed at me as they proceeded to guide me. One more thing," said Gregor. "She is a guest of ours. She is not to be harmed." One of the women took my hand in hers, her hand cold as ice. "Do not fear, madam," she whispered in my ear with a smile. "No one in the brood will be foolish enough to defy Gregor. He has given his word that you will be safe. We will take care of you." The vampire women led me down a long hallway. The hallway was elegant, lined with various paintings and ambient lighting that complemented them perfectly. The paintings themselves were less than tasteful, however, portraying scenes of torture and death. One scene depicted a lone man who had taken the liberty of impaling himself upon a rather wicked-looking spear, the blood-soaked tip protruding far away from his spine as he fell forward, his guts spilling onto the ground and reddening the soil. Another painting showed a man in the process of being drawn and quartered, his arms and legs strung up and tied to horses that pulled him apart in 4 different directions. Mercifully, the artist did not depict the man's final fate. The thematic similarities in the paintings told me they were related, possibly all done by the same person. "You like these paintings?" the leader of the group of women asked me. "I'm not exactly sure. Like is the word I would use to describe it." "Gregor's paintings," she said to me, almost with an air of nonchalance. "Of course they are. You may call me Natalia," the tall woman said with a smile. "You are Gregor's woman," I said. Natalia laughed. "Gregor enjoys the company of both men and women," she said. He does not subscribe to such old-fashioned ideals. But surely he has a favorite. No, I pressed. Natalia sucked in deep and bared her sharp fangs at me. Do not press your luck, Death Angel. I have orders not to harm you. But I do not think Gregor would mind if I toyed with you a little. A missing finger or a missing ear would hardly be something he would mind. I decided to let that one go. It would not be wise to pick a fight when one was in the middle of the enemy stronghold. We reached the end of the hallway and I found myself staring at the coldly clinical doors of an elevator. The steel doors opened right as we reached them. By now I was feeling more than a little self-conscious. After all, I was the only one in the group who continued to drip vampire refuse onto the beautiful carpets. Don't worry, said Natalia, noticing my hesitation. We will have you nice and clean and beautiful soon. We entered the elevator and the doors closed behind us. The elevator descended, and I felt the air pressure mount between my ears. I realized we were descending a long distance, far below the earth. I still wasn't quite sure what it was I had gotten myself into. Tell me about Gregor, I asked Natalia as we continued our descent. The beautiful woman smiled. Her blonde hair and blue eyes almost hid her sinister nature. Gregor is and has always been there for the brood. She said he is our savior, our master. We do not question his benevolence or his judgment. Our lives are his. What does he want from me? Natalia sucked in a deep breath at that. It is not my place, Death Angel, to guess what Gregor thinks. In my opinion, it is a mistake to bring you here. Why is it a mistake? You are the enemy. She said quite simply. You are mistaken, Natalia. I replied. I don't have any particular reason to kill any of you. All I want is information. That is what Gregor said, she said with a smile. I can only hope that he is right. Where are you taking me? To our private quarters. We shall see to it that you are properly cared for. The elevator stopped, and the steel doors opened slowly. Natalia walked through and I followed. We walked through long and seemingly endless hallways. It became clear to me that the area was massive. We crossed several rooms and an impressive amphitheater that in and of itself had to have been an architectural challenge to build underground. I marveled at my surroundings, at the lush carpeting that was present everywhere and the art that seemed to serve as a focal point for the entire enterprise. The decor in particular acted almost like a moodstone of sorts. It changed the deeper we went inside. The dark paintings with disturbing themes gave way to opulent paintings more reminiscent of the Renaissance era. The dark and disturbing imagery was replaced scenes of everyday life. I scanned the scenes as I went along. One piece depicted a young girl as she went about picking flowers, the rays of the sun in her eyes. Another painting showed little girls milking cows against the backdrop of the rising sun. Yet another scene showed a family gathering around the table in early morning. Eggs laid out all around alongside warm plates of gravy and various meats around a large table. Natalia moved ahead of us and pulled up a keycard that she put it against the sensor. The lock released and the door opened. The room that greeted us was luxurious. A massive king-size bed sat in the middle of the room, making its presence felt. I looked upon soft sheets, only the best I knew, as I looked upon it with more than a passing longing. I was exhausted. I would have loved for nothing more than to be able to sleep and forget about the multitude of problems that I now faced. The bathroom was enormous with tall ceilings. Beautiful deep blue glass tiles that glowed with a calming energy complemented the giant marble bath that acted as the centerpiece to the whole bathroom. Beautiful slate acted as an accent throughout. The whole thing was very tastefully done. Undress, Natalia instructed. I immediately obeyed. I wasn't sure why, but I didn't think it would be to my disadvantage. I pulled my black dress down, happy to be rid of it at this point. I took off my black panties next. So much of the goo had managed to seep into them, and I was happy to be rid of them. I took off my black bra as well. Thank God for small blessings. Weaning black meant I didn't have to see all the blood that covered my belongings. White would have been absolutely disgusting. Red might have been better in hindsight. Natalia had a look of disgust on her face. We will have to dispose of your clothes for obvious reasons, she said. Gregor has a room full of clothes picked out for you, she said with the faintest hint of a smile. You will find that the wardrobe not only fits you, but that it suits your taste as well. I nodded. I didn't care at this point. All I wanted was a bath. Your little sigh. Natalia asked as she moved out her palms to take it. That is something I insist on keeping, I said. As you wish, Natalia smiled. Two of the women moved into the bath and began to undress as well. Natalia turned on the water and a gentle steam began to escape from the bath. Natalia beckoned to me, please. Allow us to be of service. I grew up in a life of luxury, but I don't think I had ever been in a position where people bathed me before. It was an entirely new experience. I went into the bath and cringed as the hot water met my skin, but I found the heat to be a source of relief for me. I moved quickly to submerge myself in the soapy water. The women began to move and touching my skin, rubbing their hands all around me. I'm not sure. I like that, I said. Natalia touched a finger to my lips and quickly moved in close to me. I barely had time to realize what she was up to until it was too late. She had moved in for a kiss, locking her lips in mine. I pushed to protest but found I didn't have the strength. Natalia had her way with me. You do not decide. Death Angel, she added with a smile. What happens to you is not something you have a say in. Only Gregor decides. My heart beat fast and my face was flushed. I knew I was intoxicated at this point, both from the liquor I had imbibed back in the bar, and the adrenaline that was still coursing through my person. It didn't help that I was here naked, helpless and close to the point of exhaustion before these women. I didn't really know what to do. One of the women moved toward me. She bore in her hands an ice-cold bottle of champagne, Dom Perignon no less, and 2 frosty wine glasses. She popped the bottle open and deftly poured the contents into the glasses before handing one to me. I downed my glass without even tasting it, giving in to my senses. The hot steam of the bath was calming. Natalia took something in her hands and put it into the bath for me. Sea salt, she said. It will calm your skin, make it more supple, more yielding. More yielding to what I asked, more yielding to me. Gregor's voice spoke. I saw him materialize in the mist before me. He was naked, save for a towel that covered his privates. I was taken aback, unsure about how I would react in such a situation. Gregor immediately got into the bath with me, and I stood up quickly in reaction. It was a mistake. I forgot I was naked and I had completely revealed myself to him. You are a beautiful woman, Vanessa, he said simply. That's Miss Hunter to you, I snapped, as I quickly moved back into the bath. Are you blushing, he asked. No, I said firmly. It's the heat in here. My cheeks are flushed from the heat of the bath. If you say so, Gregor said as he moved closer to me. I would remind you that it was your specific request that I call you Vanessa. No, I said as I felt his approach. Are you saying no because you don't want to? Or no because you want this? Gregor asked again, insistent this time. Please, no, I said. You were perfectly comfortable kissing Natalia earlier, he said, as he moved his face dangerously close to mine. What's the difference between kissing her and kissing me? I felt like I was about to faint. The heat was getting to me, and Gregor wasn't doing me any favors. His good looks coupled with his mysterious eyes, my exhaustion and the liquor was making me weak. You don't have to answer me, he said with a voice that was more than just a little authoritative. He moved his hands in the water, swishing it gracefully. The water is like your desire, Vanessa, fickle, but every bit as malleable as I want it to be. I can feel the heat of your desire through the water just as surely as I can feel it in the air. You want me, he said. No, no, please don't. I can't. Daniel. I forced myself to concentrate on thoughts of the man I left behind at the restaurant, quite possibly bewildered by my actions and wondering where I was at this time. Poor Daniel. When was the last time you had consummated the act? Dear Vanessa, he reached a hand out to me, and it took all my self-control just to push it away. Please, please, no, I can't do this. What is it you want, he had asked finally. I want the very thing you have dangled in front of me to begin with. You said you knew who my killer was. Who is it? Let me get between your legs and perhaps I shall tell you. No, I said with certainty. I am not your plaything. Vampire. Make one more move and find out exactly how serious I am. I took out my scythe, ready to unleash it at any moment. I am here because you say you have information that benefits me. Name your price and end this game between you and I. Gregor smiled, and in my delusional state, I felt that the heat was playing tricks on me. A truce, he finally said. A truce, I asked. You leave the vampire nation alone for a little while, and I tell you what you came here to know, all right? I said. "And if I give my word you'll give me what I seek?" "I must admit," said Gregor finally, "I'm not entirely sure what the most enjoyable option might have been. There is a part of me that wanted to find out how you were in bed." He added. I rolled my eyes. "Please. Try not to give yourself too much credit." Gregor got up, conveniently forgetting the towel he had on him when he got in. I quickly averted my eyes. By the time I looked back at him, Gregor had put the towel back on and was smiling at me in amusement. "Do you really not like what you see, Death Angel? Shall we perhaps continue where we had left off?" "Such a shame." I refused to budge. "For all your theatrics, vampire," I said, "you have yet to leave me with anything useful. I have given you my word that your kind will not have to worry about my presence at the moment. Now is the time for you to fulfill your end of the bargain." Gregor laughed long and hard, his well-muscled shoulders heaving with mirth as he very obviously enjoyed my little statement. "Helen Rutherford, come again. I don't like repeating myself, Death Angel." Gregor's voice cut through the calm sound of the water that flowed all around us. "If you seek to find the person who murdered you, you must speak to Helen Rutherford." Chapter 15. The plot thickens. The rays of the sun glinted in the early morning as I reached Stephen Rutherford's plantation-style estate, modeled after the original antebellum Bayou sugar cane houses of the 1900s. Rutherford's estate boasted an old-world feel coupled with state-of-the-art amenities. Security was tight. The estate was gated, of course. The last time I visited the estate, I was a welcome guest. I wasn't quite so welcome this time. I strolled along the ivy-ridden walls of the Rutherford estate. Knocking on the front door wasn't going to be a good option. Or was it once we had gotten dressed? Gregor had graciously allowed me to leave. I didn't for a moment believe that a truce was what the vampire wanted. There was so much more to that initial introduction than met the eye. Still, I was grateful for having received that valuable piece of information from him, and more than a little surprised that he had let me go so easily. It was almost as if the vampire's objective all along had been to tell me about Helen Rutherford. Still, I wasn't one to dwell too much on things, and that particular line of thinking tended to lend itself to conspiracy theories. I didn't tell Death about any of it, of course. Not of the old Absinthe House, the Class DS, or Gregor Vincent. There really wasn't anything to be worried about, and telling him about my involvement in the brood might jeopardize the game plan I had already put into play. Upon further thought, I decided that walking right up to the estate and asking was the more prudent of two options. I walked up to the large iron gate and rang the bell. "May I help you?" A voice came through the intercom. "Please tell Stephen Rutherford that Haley Wellington has come to see him." "Our apologies, Ms. Wellington, but Mr. Rutherford is away on a business trip." "Perfect. That's a shame," I said, pretending to sound disappointed. "May I speak to Helen Rutherford instead?" "Please give me a few moments, ma'am," the voice on the intercom said. I waited for a good 10 minutes before the person on the other side spoke again. "Apologies for the wait, Miss Wellington. Mrs. Rutherford is in the gym at the moment, but she has extended you an invitation to join her for breakfast. Please allow us to welcome you to the Rutherford estate." The large iron gates opened, and I was greeted by a black Lexus LS in the driveway. I got in and the driver tipped his hat at me. It took a few moments for the Lexus to make its way around the estate's well-manicured grounds. Vast, well-tended gardens greeted me all around. The marble statues I had spied when I was last here were all over the place, too. There was just the slightest hint of Gothic inspiration in the way they were laid out. The mansion's beautiful facade loomed before me. As we approached, a vision of perfection against the morning light. The driver of the Lexus slowly came to a stop as he got out of the car. The soft sound of the car's sensor beeped, announcing an open door. The driver came over to my side and slowly and graciously opened the door. I got off and approached the mansion's main entrance. The massive double doors opened as I approached, and I walked into the now familiar foyer, this time devoid of the energetic band that played there the first time I had set foot into the estate. As a matter of fact, the main hall was oddly quiet. It was morning, of course, but I half expected a lively band to be playing, even during this time. I guess Stephen Rutherford's life wasn't one big party after all. The home was opulent, which was to be expected. The beautiful Macassar ebony hardwood floors greeted me upon entering. The wood was reclaimed, that much I could tell, which made it even more impressive. their antique and well-oiled finish complemented by the decidedly old-fashioned Persian carpets that seemed to span every facet of the home. A sharp-looking maid met me as I walked in, bowing gracefully. "Miss Wellington," she began carefully. "Mrs. Rutherford says she will be joining you in the main dining hall. Do you have any dietary restrictions?" I shook my head. "I'll take anything. But I do like my coffee black," I said. I seated myself at the rather long European walnut table that was as welcoming as it was handsome. The maid smiled. "You have fine taste, madam," she said. Noticing my fascination with the walnut table, and that she does said a voice unexpectedly, I whirled around suddenly surprised. The woman that greeted me wasn't quite what I was expecting. She was beautiful from head to toe, a timeless vision of beauty and poise. She was dressed casually, wearing only the pink outfit she'd used for her gym workout. She had a towel around her shoulders that she moved from side to side playfully. Helen Rutherford was impressive, even dressed in something so basic. Her blonde hair was cut short bobbed, but it suited her frame well. She wasn't particularly skinny. She was probably in her 50s, maybe 60s from my guess, although I could clearly see from the cut of her top that she was in fine form. Her muscular and well-sculpted arms told me she worked out pretty often. She was pretty tall as well, standing at 5 foot 11 inches. She would have been stunning in a black evening dress. I was a little disappointed that my preoccupation with Daniel that evening caused me to miss meeting Helen at that party. "So tell me," Helen began, "what does a client of Richard Grimm's possibly want with the wife of Stephen Rutherford?" She asked me with just the faintest hint of a crooked smile on her lips. I kept my guard up the entire time. Something told me this was no ordinary woman that stood before me. No amount of small talk was going to get me out of this one. It was time to play my hand. I decided to go big or go home. "I'm here to ask you about the murder of Vanessa Hunter." Helen took one hard look at me. "You must have me and my husband confused with someone else." "My dear Helen," said her eyes boring into mine, "you are being comically tragic with your flawed questions." Perhaps I said, refusing to take my eyes off her. "But are my questions really flawed?" Helen's smile disappeared from her lips, and there was just the strangest gleam in her eyes. "Who gave you that story, I wonder? Has Richard Grimm been feeding you his conspiracy theories again?" I shook my head. "Richard Grimm has nothing to do with it, I'm afraid. A man by the name of Gregor Vincent told me to seek you out." I said bingo. That got her attention. Helen tensed up as she heard the name. She put the towel that had been hanging around her neck and shoulders onto the table, and moved to pour herself a coffee from one of the glass carafes that had been laid at the table. "Please," she gestured, "the food will grow cold, and I would very much like to extend my hospitality." The breakfast table had been laid out beautifully. Rows of fresh fruit and pastries were laid out. Perfectly poached eggs, ham toast, and even grits. Orange juice stood beside the coffee in crystal carafes. I sat down and continued to look at her intently. Helen laughed at that. "Do you always take things so seriously?" she asked. "Only when it comes to matters of life and death." I said simply, "And how, pray tell, is the murder of an heiress a matter of life and death for you?" "Let's just say the matter is a lot closer to my heart than you might believe," I said. Helen chuckled at that. "It appears Richard Grimm has been telling you more than a fair share of fairy tales." She took a large strawberry from the fruit tray that had been laid out before us and took a bite. "Richard has always had," she paused for effect, "a flair for the dramatic," she said finally with a smile. "There's not much here for you to go off of, Miss Wellington. The police have investigated the matter rather thoroughly. You might want to speak to Detective Lyons regarding the matter." "Detective Lyons?" "Yes, haven't they told you? Raymond Lyons is assigned to the Vanessa Hunter case. He's won the best, New Orleans finest, as they say. You still haven't told me what the name Gregor Vincent means to you." I pushed Helen further. "Mr. Vincent is a businessman. He owns a number of establishments all around New Orleans. The Old Absinthe House is one of his businesses." "Is he a legitimate businessman?" "Listen, Miss Wellington, I'm not entirely sure what you're insinuating this early in the morning, but my husband and I only associate with legitimate businesses. Businesses like Ashcroft Pharmaceutical." Helen's face darkened. "Young lady, I have been nothing but welcoming of you so far, but your rather brusque manner of questioning is beginning to get old." I shook my head. "My apologies, madam. It is a failing of the Wellingtons. We are a rather forward bunch. Helen smiled and shook her head. Perhaps it is I who must apologize. I am quite impatient after a workout. Did you know her? I asked. No. Who? Vanessa Hunter. Helen appeared to be lost in thought. She took the handles of her coffee cup in her slender hands, her fingers wrapping themselves around the curved bone china handle, her other hand holding the saucer delicately. I knew her by association, she said finally. I'm not quite sure I'm satisfied with that. I answered. And what answer would satisfy you? Helen snapped back. It was time to get serious and drop the pretenses. Gregor Vincent heads up the Vampire Nation. He did not send me to you to exchange silly banter, I said. Now you either continue on with the silly facade you are putting up, or you and I finally come to an agreement and start talking about serious things. Helen was silent for a few moments. She took several sips of her coffee before she answered. Do you know who Astrid Hunter was? She finally said to me. Yes, I said. Astrid was Vanessa's mother. Indeed, Helen replied. She was very beautiful. You know, her voice trailed, unsure of what to say even back then. She stood out like no other woman. Astrid did. My father did not always talk about my mother, but when he did, it was always with the same reverence that Helen used now. I never got to meet my mother. She passed away giving birth to me, and that was that. It was only through stories that my father and grandmother would tell me that I would gradually come to know about my birth mother. In a way, because I had grown up without a mother, I was already different from many kids. Astrid Hunter passed away 19 years ago, I said. I know of the sad circumstances, I responded. Yes. Such a tragic turn of events. What did they tell you of her passing? The question caught me off guard. Why would Helen ask me about the circumstances if she was already aware of Astrid? She died in childbirth, I said simply. That wasn't necessarily true, said Helen. Astrid died shortly after giving birth to a beautiful young girl. But she was around for a little while. Even around long enough to name the child. She held Vanessa in her arms, you know. She'd take the child and coddle her. Astrid had never had a child to call her own before that time. She loved Vanessa dearly. What happened to Astrid? I pressed Helen. Complications in childbirth. Helen responded, but she cut herself off. She did not speak for a long time after that. It is far more complicated than that, she said finally. She took a piece of paper and wrote something on it before handing it to me. If you want to learn the truth, start here, she said finally. Sylvia Van Dyke. I read. 4371, Ashford Lane. This is a Georgia address. I said finally. If you wish to learn the truth behind Vanessa Hunter, then that is where you must begin, said Helen. How is it that you happen to know so much about Vanessa Hunter? I asked. Speak to Sylvia first, Helen said. Then come back to see me, Haley Wellington. There is so much more to this story than meets the eye, she said. As is the case with you, I responded. Helen smiled at me. I would very much like to continue our conversation. After all, it is not every day that a death angel comes calling on me. Chapter 16 Answers. Savannah, Georgia was the last place I expected to find myself. Still, in my insatiable quest to find out the truth behind my own murder, the trail I was following had now led me here. This place in a way was very similar to New Orleans. It evoked images of beautiful Victorian homes, against the backdrop of the sprawling Savannah River, of warm nights sitting outside, the breeze carrying the sweet smell of honeysuckle. A wonderful energy was present in the 18th century garden squares and gourmet restaurants, blessing Savannah with a vibrant Southern culture that one couldn't find anywhere else. It had not been easy to convince Death to stay behind.
Vanessa Sherrier.
You are hiding far too many things from moi, he had said in his half-feigned despondent tone. Me keep secrets from you never, Richard I had responded. In the end, Death sighed, and I had my way. I had taken the opportunity to avail myself of a few amenities this time. I now had a smartphone, which was a godsend. I still could not believe how many days I had lasted without it. 4G was a modern marvel that no person should have to live without. One of the very first things I did was call Daniel. I explained why I had to disappear suddenly and sincerely apologize for my behavior. I was also smart enough to dangle the carrot in front of him first. I had wanted to make amends. Would he be willing to come to my place for dinner? If I cooked, I had wondered aloud. He took the bait, of course. with very little prodding on my part. A home-cooked Italian dinner from yours truly was just the thing Daniel needed to get over his initial disappointment. With that episode neatly wrapped up, I decided to focus on this other thing. The address that Helen Rutherford gave me was in Savannah's historic district. I decided to take a road trip from New Orleans to Savannah. Of course, I decided to drive in style, appropriating in black Mercedes SLS AMG for the occasion. The sleek, black curves of the gullwing drew attention to me like no other, but I felt that I was entitled to this, having gone through the things that I had. It was all on death's dime, of course, which was yet another thing that I enjoyed. If I was going to be dead, I might as well live it up. The home that greeted me was a huge departure from the Rutherford estate. It was a rather quaint old townhome that was nondescript. The walls were dilapidated. The tiny lawn had been neglected. Weeds and other embarrassing growths had overrun the place. Still, it had its own charms, with its old-world feel. I might even have gone so far to call it quaint, perhaps, but not something that could have been described as luxurious by any stretch. I stood before the dark green door that greeted me and used the knocker to announce my presence. The door opened cautiously and ever so slightly. A woman who looked to be in her 70s answered. "We do not take solicitations," the old woman said. "I'm not here for that," I said, smiling at the old lady. "I received your address from Helen Rutherford." The woman's demeanor changed altogether as she heard that. She pulled me into her home, her right hand reaching out to my arm, pulling me insistently into her home. Her hair was graying and her clothes appeared to be from another day and time. Still, despite her dated appearance, I could tell that she worked hard to maintain that appearance. "Please allow me to welcome you into my humble home," the old woman said. But perhaps I am forgetting my manners in my old age. "My name is Sylvia," she said. I nodded. "Sylvia Van Dyke," I said as I extended my hand to shake hers. "My name is Haley Wellington. And what can I do for you this morning, Miss Wellington?" I looked around Sylvia Van Dyke's residence. It was almost a caricature of an elderly person's home. I saw the later porcelain figures all carefully displayed atop wooden display cases. Later has its charms, I was sure. But the only thing the innocent little pieces of porcelain ever did for me was make me feel out of place. "Helen told me to speak to you in regard to Vanessa Hunter's death," I said. Finally, a sigh escaped Sylvia's lips. There was a forlorn look upon her careworn face. "It was a terrible shame for that child," she said finally. "Vanessa had so much to live for. But that demon had to have his way in the end." "Demon?" Sylvia chuckled. "How well did you know Vanessa Hunter, my dear?" "Well enough," I said, trying hard to hide my smile. "This story begins and ends with Astrid Hunter." I nodded. "I'm all ears. Please tell me the story." "When Astrid was very young, she looked a lot like Vanessa. She was always the prettiest girl in the room, and rightfully so. She bore such a regal and commanding presence that everyone took notice." I noticed a distant expression in Sylvia's eyes as she spoke. "How did you know Astrid?" I asked. Sylvia smiled. "Astrid was my younger sister," she said. "Interesting. I didn't know my mother had a sister. I was told Vanessa's mother was an only child. Just like Vanessa herself, indeed. That is what they tell people. Well over a decade separates Astrid and I in age. And we've been estranged for so long. Such shame. Because we were so close when we were younger." "What changed the demon?" "That's the second time you've referred to a demon. Can you elaborate on that?" "Of course, dear. That man. The monster who ruined Astrid and Vanessa's lives. I am referring to none other than Donovan Hunter." "Donovan Hunter?" I asked incredulously. I couldn't believe my ears. That can't be right. "Donovan was a good father to Vanessa." Sylvia smiled. "Of course he was. Vanessa was the culmination of all his efforts. His research, everything that Donovan lived for. His hopes and dreams lay with the power that was behind his daughter." "What do you mean by that?" "In due time, my dear," said Sylvia. "This story is complex, and you must hear it all the way through so that you might understand." "Then by all means please continue," I said. I remember the very first time Astrid introduced me to Donovan. He was very handsome, charming, a man who knew where he was going. He was very driven even back then. He worked tirelessly toward his goals. "Donovan grew up poor, didn't he, in Illinois farmland?" "Back in Champaign, indeed," said Sylvia. "But he was a brilliant man. He put himself through school on his own. He was an engineering genius even back then, when technology wasn't so relevant. He was making gadgets that were ahead of their time. His knowledge of the intricate workings of machines was next to no one. Donovan was considered by many to be a genius ahead of his time. I agreed. Sylvia's expression turned grave. Indeed he was, she said with a faint bit of sadness in her voice. Are you familiar with the singularity? I nodded. A time in the future when machines would become smarter than human beings. It was popularized by Ray Kurzweil and Bill Joy. Sylvia nodded and smiled. Donovan became obsessed with the singularity. It was harmless in the beginning, but gradually it became unhealthy. It consumed him. Hunter Robotics was started in the beginning to further the cause of mankind. Donovan believed that machines existed to serve mankind. Hunter Robotics furthering the future of mankind. I said with a smile. Sylvia smiled at that. Yes. That was the slogan they used during Donnie's time. I remember it took him over 13 years to make the company profitable. He came up with device after device and they were all brilliant, but too far ahead of their time. No one wanted them because no one could come up with a practical use for them. But that changed, didn't it? I asked. Of course it did. If Donnie stuck to his guns, he never would have prospered. What changed? Donnie discovered nanotechnology in the 80s. Back then, they were the sole domain of science fiction nuts. No one really believed it was possible to miniaturize robots. But Donnie had a vision. He saw the improvements in microarchitecture being made at the time. Read about the advances that were being made in Silicon Valley. If Intel could shrink their chips consistently over time, then Hunter Robotics could do the same with its machines. To continuously be able to decrease their size while increasing the intelligence of his robots became Donovan Hunter's goal in life. And this all happened before Vanessa's birth. This was all before Vanessa was born. But Donnie was already dating Astrid. Sylvia said with a smile. If I may indulge myself for a moment, sweetie, I would have added that Astrid was absolutely smitten with Donovan Hunter. At this point, however, she barely even saw him. He was so busy and all his time was spent running the business. Astrid probably had at best only a few minutes a day to spend with Donnie, but she deeply treasured the time they spent together. Donnie has his path, she would often tell me. And I sat there listening to her sadness, helpless, in a way, not knowing how I could ease Astrid's suffering. I knew she suffered, of course, the old woman added, with a hint of indignation in her voice. You yourself have never married? I asked. Sylvia smiled at the questions. No, darling. I have not really had the chance to, she said. The years go by and I swear, it's like it was still yesterday. But time waits for no one, I'm afraid. I have whiled away the years, and time has been unkind to me, she said finally. When did Astrid marry Donovan? I think it was the summer of '91. My memory fails me, I'm afraid, dear. But it was a really simple ceremony. Astrid was a vision in her wedding dress. There had to have been 20 people maximum in the group that saw them tie the knot. Close friends and family only. Donnie's entire fortune was tied up in Hunter Robotics, and cash was tight at the time, so they couldn't afford to be extravagant still. Astrid glowed like no other creature on Earth. Her beauty was, well, otherworldly, could possibly be the only way to describe it. Did the wedding take place in Illinois? I asked. I hadn't been entirely sure about this part. Why? What an odd question to ask, Sylvia said. But interesting nonetheless. Back in the day, Donnie had begun a rather odd association with another prominent person back then, a man by the name of Donald Ashcroft. Daniel Ashcroft's father? I asked. Indeed, said Sylvia. Donald was everything that Donnie was not. He was born into money, and he had significant resources. Donald was the man that Donnie only dreamt he could become. There was such a large gulf between them. Donald was Harvard educated, the oldest of 3 siblings and next in line to take over the Ashcroft dynasty. Ashcroft was third-generation wealth at the time, having had interests in several different areas, but most notably in the pharmaceutical industry. The company's founder, Alexander Ashcroft, had immigrated in the 1920s from England and had wanted to find his fortunes in America. It was the Roaring '20s, and America was young at heart. Alexander made his way into New Orleans. I did not know how far back Ashcroft dated. Indeed, it was an interesting time for Alexander. He had just immigrated to the United States, from London no less. and he had yet to make any connections with the business community. But Alexander had a dream and he made it happen. Against the backdrop of the mob and the massive economic resurgence that occurred during the Roaring Twenties, Alexander Ashcroft built himself an empire that would span several generations. And Donald, the grandson, was the person that served as the focal point for Donovan Hunter's economic success. I asked, "It's important to note," Haley said Sylvia, "that things were uncertain for Donnie Hunter back in the day. He had cash flow problems, a result of recklessly over-leveraging himself too early. He had built an extraordinarily long timeline for success into his business, but he was a victim of being far too prescient for his own good." "What does that mean?" I asked. "Donovan Hunter needed a visionary who could see as far into the future as he could," Sylvia continued. "And Donald was that person?" I asked. Donald Spencer Ashcroft was a man who lived in his father's and grandfather's shadow. His father, John Edward Ashcroft, did not marry until late in life. Donald was often left to his own devices while his father continued the legacy that was built by his grandfather. He was brilliant in his own right, but he could not escape the legacy of his predecessors. "Just like Daniel," I whispered. "So Donald needed to start his own legacy, to make his own mark and move beyond his father and his grandfather's shadows." I said. "Indeed," said Sylvia, "but even back then, Donald felt trapped. New Orleans was the bastion of his family's power, and he felt that the only way he could ever escape his family's influence was to leave New Orleans. So he moved to Chicago back in the day, dear," Sylvia continued. "Chicago was a major hub for economic activity. Many a warm-blooded young man would have gravitated toward Chicago given the option. And fate put the two men in touch with each other. Donald happened to attend a lecture that Donnie was giving at the University of Chicago in the early 90s. Said Sylvia. The lecture itself was innocuous enough. Just a small study into miniaturization and the power that lay in the shrinking silicon microarchitecture that was to be the defining moment for the Silicon Valley movement. But instead of California, this revolution was happening in Chicago of all places. And this brilliant man was behind it all. So Donald found himself attracted to Donovan Hunter." I asked. "Attracted is a good word for it." Donald was drawn to Donovan's brilliance, at his simple manner of speaking. But far more than that, Donald saw in Donnie his opportunity to break away from his family's circle of influence and strike out on his own. Donald became one of Donnie Hunter's earliest investors. I said. "Donald Ashcroft saved Hunter Robotics from bankruptcy," said Sylvia. She stood up now and paced the old carpet that had been laid out carefully on the immaculately clean floors of her home. "So with Donovan's money situation handled, he could finally focus on his nanotechnology." "Yes, that is correct. But that was the beginning of the change that happened to Donovan Hunter. What happened in those next few years was truly dreadful for poor Astrid." "What happened during that time?" Sylvia had a sad look on her face. But it passed and she smiled faintly. "That's when Donovan found out just how special Astrid was, how unique our family was." Sylvia turned to me gravely then, her eyes looking straight at mine without speaking for a few moments. "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "That's when Donovan Hunter found out that the Van Dyke family possessed powers beyond the realm of human experience.